when I finished, we were given the choice of one or two places we would like to go to, and being from a small country town like Oamaru, I was given Auckland or Invercargill. I hadn't been to either, and I thought, well, you know, across that strait, when you have to catch a ferry, that divides the country really, and I didn't fancy that going right to. I wasn't adventurous enough, and probably I was more a home-born person and had had a very happy home life, so I wasn't wanting to leave my parents and go too far, because in those days they didn't travel so much. My mother had, but my father was a bit, only Sydney was about the last, and that was pretty venturesome, but he wasn't an adventurous person. So I thought, now I'll stay and I'll go to Invercargill. And of course I went down there to freeze to death, and a friend said, well, you can stay with me. So down I went, and they were greeted very nicely, and I was the only physio. And it was quite a big hospital, but it has gained in size by now. And we didn't have a pool or anything like that. So I had to be jack of all trades, as you are in a physio too, because there are a lot of extra bits to it, aren't there? So surprising. People just don't realise. We had to study for those different things and pass those exams. And anyway, it was a very, very countrified, I thought, down there after being in Dunedin with everything laid on. Or there was a physio, yes, she was in charge, an older person with very set ideas, and physio was all this sort of thing. And she just did this with her hand. None of that sort of hands-on proper training. She just sort of sat. She sat on a chair beside the patient, lying on the bed, and they did this. She just did this, and I used to think, for goodness sake. I couldn't say anything because he was about 20 years older than I was, or more. And she didn't undress the patient. Now, that horrified me. I didn't know what to do about that, because we had been used to stripping people down to their waists and doing their back and their shoulders, or when you massage the shoulder, she'd keep the clothes on. And she would sort of pull them aside a wee bit and then just do her massage. It was terrible, and it was so antiquated. I thought, I won't be able to stay here, but of course I was bonded to stay there with the war being on. And boys, by this time, the ships had been coming into Dunedin, and they were brought down in the ambulance to the hospital. So we had a lot of them, and they needed proper treatment. They were really in slings and in wheelchairs and on crutches. They were all from the hospital ships. So it was quite an interesting time. I had a lot of variety I wouldn't have had normally, because the wards wouldn't have very many patients. If they were bad enough, they would go up to Dunedin, and that's the specialists would have to see them. We didn't really have specialists in those days coming down from Dunedin, but they have now, and they have to Oamaru too, which keeps you in touch with the world. So I just had to make my own way there, and then I had to take the physio at night. I had to come back, and of course I was riding a bicycle, and I was miles away from the hospital. It was built out in the country, literally in the country. So I thought it was a terrible place when I went first. There were trams, and you caught the tram right in town, and there was only a set route, of course. And I had got bored by this time for the lady whose husband was a prisoner of war, and I had to come into town to catch a tram on a bicycle. No, I caught a bus, that's right, a bus from her door, down into town, got on a tram, and I travelled right out into the hospital to within about a mile of us, of the hospital. The tram with the terminus stopped and let me off, and I had to get out, and literally I had to face the weather, and the rain came at you like that, and it came and hit you once and then bounced back again. You got it almost twice. The wind was like that, and it took me busy to stand against it, walking. I had to lean right down. So then I had to go out into, it's in the country, and got to these lovely big gates, and a lovely brick hospital was sitting out there all in glory, but it was so inaccessible. I don't know how people managed. And I would then have a lot of patients, and one of the first few I had were men who had hurt their shoulders. Well, of course, they never recovered, getting full movement, and that was terrible. Some of them were men who had outside jobs or perhaps, manual work, and they had to get better, but they were put up onto a frame and bandaged to that, and that was the only height they could get, but they couldn't get that on their own. Their muscles were absolutely shattered, and since I've learnt that's a terrible thing. That is possibly the biceps tendon, the two heads that it's got, breaking, either one or both, and if one broke, they could get a certain amount. They couldn't even dress themselves. They were outpatients, and they used to come on the tram too. Eventually, 2 or 3 of my patients thought, that's no good, you're walking there, and they drove cars. So I used to have sometimes 3 meet me at the tram, and all sort of vying with each other. Now, which car I'm going to get into today? This is embarrassing. I can't favour anyone. But they were so kind that they thought, oh, poor young girl walking into that weather. And it was weather like that nearly all the time. It's a terrible climate, really. And I suppose I was young and didn't feel so cold. But anyway, that's how I got to work in the end. And I stayed there all day, of course, and had to have my lunch. My lady I boarded with made my lunch. And then I came back the same thing at night. Well, you see, it was quite a trek to go back in the tram into town. And then I had to make sure I could catch a bus out to where I was. Eventually I got a bicycle, and then I used to be able to take a shortcut.